Leah Marshall was running late again. The New Orleans heat clung to the early morning air as she pulled up in front of the courthouse, gripping the wheel a little too tight. The dashboard clock flashed 8:50 a.m., 10 minutes. 10 minutes until she had to take her seat on the bench, gavel in hand, presiding over a case that could change everything. Her stomach tightened. She had handled tough cases before: murder trials, corruption scandals, high-profile frauds. But this one was different. This was Kevin Daniels, a 22-year-old black man who had been arrested without cause, detained because he fit the description. The officer who put him in cuffs had no real evidence, just instinct. And instinct, Leah knew, had a nasty habit of looking a lot like bias. As she stepped out of her car, the buzz of reporters swarmed the front steps, cameras poised and eager for a spectacle. Leah adjusted the strap of her leather bag and squared her shoulders. No time for the media. She opted for the side entrance instead. Her heels clicked against the pavement, her mind already cycling through courtroom procedures, jury instructions, and the arguments she'd hear today. Then, a voice cut through the air. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification." Leah stopped short. A young white officer, no older than 30, stood rigid near the entrance. His uniform was crisp, his posture stiff, and his gaze sharp, too sharp. She could tell before he said another word. He wasn't just doing his job, he was watching her. She let out a slow breath and reached for her ID badge, the one that hung from a lanyard around her neck. "I'm Judge Marshall," she said, lifting it higher for him to see. "I'm presiding over the Daniels case this morning." The officer didn't even glance at the badge. His eyes moved up and down her frame, his gaze slow, calculated, assessing something beyond just her credentials. Then he said it. "There's been an incident nearby, and you match the description of someone involved. I'm going to need you to answer a few questions." Silence. For a moment, Leah couldn't even process it. The irony hit her like a fist to the ribs. She was about to oversee a trial on racial profiling, and yet, here she was, being profiled, right on the courthouse steps. She kept her voice calm. "Officer, I don't have time for this. The trial starts in 10 minutes. I need to get inside." She held out her badge again, waiting for him to realize his mistake, but he didn't. His hand hovered over his belt, dangerously close to his cuffs. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he snapped, stepping closer. "You need to come with me." Her pulse jumped. She had seen that look before. The one that said her suit didn't matter, her title didn't matter, her degrees, her years on the bench, her reputation, none of it mattered. Not in this moment, not to him. And that's when she knew. He had already decided who she was before she even spoke. Before she could say another word, a deep voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Both Leah and the officer turned. An older black officer was approaching, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. And then recognition flickered across his face. "Judge Marshall?" His voice held both surprise and something else, concern. Leah gave a tight nod. "Yes." The older officer turned sharply to the young cop. "Stand down." His voice was firm, carrying an authority that couldn't be ignored. The young officer hesitated. "She matches the description. That's the judge." The older cop's voice turned steely. "Do you want to lose your job?" A long, tense beat. Then, reluctantly, the younger officer took a step back, his lips pressing into a thin line. He still looked angry, as if someone had taken something from him. Leah forced herself to take a slow breath. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the older officer asked, his voice softer now. Leah nodded, though her jaw was clenched. "I'm fine, thank you." And then, without another word, she walked past them, pushing open the courthouse doors. Inside, the cool, sterile halls welcomed her like an old friend. The tension outside was already being swallowed by the routine of the courtroom, but as she walked, her heartbeat still pounded in her ears. She had spent her entire career fighting against this exact kind of prejudice. And yet, even at the height of her success, even as a judge, she still wasn't safe from it. The trial hadn't even started yet, and already she was living proof of why it mattered. The moment Leah stepped into the courtroom, the noise outside faded, swallowed by the solemn hum of justice at work. Lawyers murmured over last-minute strategies. The court reporter adjusted her microphone, and the bailiff stood at attention, eyes steady as always. But Leah could still feel it. That officer's voice, his tone, the way his hand hovered over his belt, it clung to her like a second skin. She inhaled sharply. Not now. Focus. This case was bigger than her. She took her seat behind the bench, adjusting her robes as she glanced at the defendant's table. Kevin Daniels sat stiffly, hands clasped in front of him, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. He was young, too young to be facing the kind of charge that could upend his entire life. Across the room, the prosecutor sat upright, flipping through notes with calculated ease. And a few feet behind him, the officer responsible for Kevin's arrest, Officer Jeremy Calloway, stood, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. Leah's fingers curled around her gavel. All rise. The room shifted in unison as she called the court to order. The trial began. The prosecution started strong. Kevin Daniels had been walking home at night, alone, when Officer Calloway stopped him, believing he matched the description of a suspect in an ongoing burglary case. According to Calloway, Kevin had been acting evasive, and when asked for ID, he hesitated, just long enough to raise suspicion. Suspicion. That word again. The same word the officer outside the courthouse had used on her just minutes ago. Leah kept her face neutral as she listened to the testimony, but inside something churned. Calloway spoke with certainty, his words practiced, his voice just controlled enough to seem professional, yet not enough to mask the quiet arrogance underneath. Mr. Daniels refused to cooperate, Calloway said, glancing toward the jury. I was left with no choice but to detain him for questioning. At that point, he became aggressive, raising his voice, making threats. Kevin stiffened in his seat. Leah caught the small motion and held up a hand before his lawyer could object. Officer Calloway, she said evenly, did Mr. Daniels have any weapons on him? Calloway hesitated. No, Your Honor. Did he steal anything? Another pause. No, Your Honor. Was he doing anything illegal at the time of the stop? Calloway's jaw tightened. He fit the description. There it was. Leah let the silence stretch, forcing the courtroom to sit in the weight of those words. The description, she repeated, tapping her fingers against the bench. Officer, do you recall the exact description you were given that night? Calloway shifted slightly. It was brief. Black male, early 20s, dark hoodie, jeans. Leah arched a brow. Would you say that description applies to a large percentage of young black men in this city? Kevin's lawyer stood. Objection, Your Honor. Leah cut him off with a look. I'm simply clarifying whether this description was specific or general. Calloway hesitated. It was broad, but we were working with what we had at the time. Leah folded her hands. And yet, despite no evidence of a crime, no stolen property, no weapons, you still detained him? Calloway's expression hardened. I acted within protocol. Protocol. Another word with far too much power. Leah exhaled slowly, turning to Kevin's defense attorney. Proceed. The defense wasted no time. Kevin had been walking home from his job at a local diner, still wearing his work uniform under his hoodie. He had headphones in, which was why he didn't immediately respond when Calloway called out to him. That moment of hesitation? That was all it took. What followed was a chain reaction of assumptions, one stacking on top of the other until Calloway saw Kevin not as a tired young man on his way home, but as a threat. The cross-examination cut deep. Kevin's lawyer was relentless, pointing out the glaring holes in the arrest. There had been no actual report of a crime in progress when Calloway stopped Kevin. The real suspect, later caught on camera, was 2 inches shorter, stockier, and wearing a different colored hoodie. Kevin never resisted, despite Calloway's claims. In fact, a witness recorded the incident on their phone, a video. Kevin's lawyer played the footage. It was shaky, taken from a low angle but clear enough. Kevin stood still, hands raised, speaking calmly. It was Calloway who escalated. The video showed Calloway stepping toward Kevin, getting in his face, voice rising. Then, Calloway shoved Kevin first. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The jury watched, their expressions shifting, the weight of reality pressing in. Leah looked at Calloway, whose face was turning a deep shade of red. "Officer, is this what you meant by resisting?" Calloway's throat bobbed. That footage is incomplete. He was acting suspicious before—" "Suspicious," Leah repeated, her voice sharp now. "Because he was standing there? Because he took a second to process being stopped? Tell me, officer, what exactly did he do that was suspicious?" Calloway had no answer, because there wasn't one. By the time closing arguments began, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. The jury was listening differently now, their expressions heavier, more thoughtful. Leah could feel it. Justice wasn't just about what happened inside a courtroom. It was about everything that led up to it, about the choices made. The assumptions, the power behind every single decision. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Leah sat back, heart pounding, not just for Kevin, but for herself. Because this wasn't just about him, it was about every person who had ever been stopped, questioned, detained, and judged before the trial even began. And today, Leah Marshall had the power to decide what happened next. The courtroom was heavy with silence. Leah sat at the bench, hands clasped before her, watching the jury file back in. The weight of their decision settled over the room like a slow-building storm. Kevin Daniels sat at the defense table, shoulders squared but tense, his lawyer whispering something to him that Leah couldn't hear. Across the aisle, Officer Jeremy Calloway sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tight it looked as if his teeth might crack. Leah took a slow breath. "Jury, have you reached a verdict?" A middle-aged woman in a navy blazer stood, clutching a folded slip of paper in her hands. "We have, Your Honor." She passed the paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to Leah. Leah unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words, her expression unreadable. But inside, a storm raged. She had been here before, many times. She had seen justice delivered, justice denied, and justice warped beyond recognition. She had heard excuses, justifications, and outright lies, and she had felt the weight of what it meant to hold power in her hands. Slowly, she nodded and passed the paper back. "Please read the verdict." The juror cleared her throat. "On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant, Kevin Daniels, not guilty." A ripple went through the room. Leah caught the barely there movement of Kevin exhaling, his shoulders relaxing a fraction. His mother, seated in the back row, clasped her hands together, a silent prayer of relief. The juror continued. "On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant not guilty." Another wave of emotion rolled through the courtroom. Leah's gaze flickered to Calloway. His face was pale now, his hands balled into fists. She tapped her gavel once. "Mr. Daniels, you are free to go." The words should have felt like victory, but Leah knew better. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Kevin had been arrested without cause, dragged through a legal system that had chewed up too many young black men before him. He had spent months in a cell before making bail. He had lost his job. His name had been dragged through the mud. And the officer who did this? He would go back to work tomorrow, like nothing had ever happened. As the courtroom emptied, Kevin and his family lingered, shaking hands with his lawyer, accepting quiet congratulations from a few sympathetic faces. Leah gathered her things, ready to retreat to her chambers, when a voice stopped her. "Judge Marshall." She turned. Officer Calloway stood before her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was a living, breathing thing, twisting in the air like a coiled snake. "You got what you wanted," Calloway said finally. His voice was flat, but his eyes burned. Leah arched a brow. "I didn't get anything, Officer Calloway. This wasn't about me." He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "People like you," her patience snapped. "People like me?" She took a step closer. "You mean judges? Black women? People who refuse to look the other way?" Calloway's face twisted. "You don't know what it's like out there. You sit behind your bench, making decisions that don't cost you anything. But on the streets, we don't get the luxury of—" "Luxury?" Leah let out a bitter laugh. "You really think I don't know what it's like to be judged on sight? You think that badge gives you the right to decide who is and isn't a suspect?" Calloway's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Leah shook her head. You don't see yourself as the villain. I get that. But tell me, Officer Calloway, how many times have you done this before? How many young men have you stopped just because they fit the description? How many of them never had a video to prove the truth? Silence. That was the answer. Calloway's nostrils flared, but he said nothing. He turned and stormed out, his footsteps heavy against the marble floor. Leah stood there for a moment, exhaling slowly, feeling tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Justice had been served today, but justice shouldn't require a fight every time. She turned, gathering her things, walking out of the courtroom with her head high. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Leah sat in her chambers, the weight of the day pressing down on her like a lead blanket. The courtroom was empty now, the echoes of the trial still lingering in her mind. Kevin Daniels was free, but freedom was a complicated thing. What did freedom mean after months of wrongful incarceration? After losing a job, a sense of safety, a belief in fairness? Her hands rested on the smooth wood of her desk, dark mahogany, polished, sturdy, like the gavel she had wielded that morning, a symbol of power, of law, of control. And yet, for all its weight, the gavel had never been enough. A sharp knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She already knew who it was before she answered. Chief Bernard Wallace. The older black officer, the one who had stepped in that morning when she had been stopped at the courthouse entrance, the one who had saved her from becoming another headline. Leah gestured for him to come in, watching as he lowered himself into the chair across from her. He exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his graying beard. Hell of a day. Leah gave a dry chuckle. That's one way to put it. Wallace leaned forward, folding his hands together. I wanted to check on you. That whole mess outside should have never happened. Leah met his eyes. But it did. He sighed, nodding. I know, and I know it's not the first time. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Leah spoke. What happens to Calloway now? Wallace's face tightened. I've already spoken to Internal Affairs. The footage doesn't lie. He's looking at disciplinary action, but... He trailed off, rubbing his jaw. Leah finished the sentence for him. But he'll keep his job. Wallace hesitated. Then, a slow, reluctant nod. Of course. Leah let out a slow breath, the anger simmering beneath her skin. How do you do it? She asked suddenly, her voice quieter now. Wear that badge knowing how many Calloways are out there? Wallace leaned back, his face unreadable. Same way you sit on that bench, knowing how many Kevin Daniels are going to walk through your courtroom. The words hit like a punch to the ribs. He let them settle before continuing. I do it because if I don't, someone worse takes my place. And I'd rather be here fighting from the inside than letting people like Calloway run unchecked. Leah studied him for a long moment. She understood, more than she wanted to. Finally, she asked, Do you ever feel like it's not enough? Wallace exhaled, shaking his head. Every damn day. They sat in silence, two people on opposite sides of the same fight. Two people who had spent their entire lives trying to hold a system accountable, only to watch it bend, but never quite break. Finally, Wallace stood. Take care of yourself, Judge Marshall. Leah nodded. You too, Chief. As he left, Leah turned back to her desk. Her fingers grazed over the gavel, her reflection staring back at her in its polished surface. She had won today, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. With a slow breath, she straightened her spine. Tomorrow, she'd do it all over again, because that's what it meant to fight. That's what it meant to be Leah Marshall.